The English like to give their heavy, multi-engined aircraft the names of the greatest cities of their overseas possessions. In this way, they emphasized the worldwide might of the British colonial empire, on which the sun never set. Vickers, Wellington, Bristol, Bombay, Blackburn, Perth. The last in that series became Canberra. But by an irony of fate, when the bomber with that name first flew, the empire had already dissolved and Canberra had become the capital of an independent Australian state. In the middle of 1944, the British Ministry of Aircraft began to draw up a specification for the first British jet bomber. Some prerequisites for this already existed. The British had accumulated a certain amount of experience in designing, producing, and operating turbojet engines and aircraft equipped with them, such as the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire. Perhaps the leaders of the British aviation industry were prompted by reconnaissance data about Germany's jet bomber Arado Blitz. However, because the matter was new, the 1944 specification was more indicative than definitive. It was developed with an obvious glance at the legendary Mosquito, and the British themselves did not hide that they expected the new bomber to be a jet successor to the legendary wooden aircraft. The main characteristics envisaged were a cruise speed of 500 miles per hour, a range of 1,550 miles, an operational ceiling from 36,000 to 46,000 feet, and a bomb load of 6,000 pounds. The task of designing a fundamentally new bomber was taken up by the firm English Electric in the town of Preston, in the county of Lancashire in eastern England. At that time, the firm was engaged in licensed production of aircraft and aviation equipment, and could afford to undertake forward-looking design work. Moreover, in 1944, the head of the company's design bureau became the well-known designer William Teddy Petter, who had come from Westland Aircraft. Petter was famous for his light multi-role aircraft, the Lysander, and the fighter Whirlwind. In designing the new machine, Petter, taking into account wartime experience and the customer's requirements, chose the concept of a light, high-altitude bomber with long range, fairly high speed, and maneuverability. This allowed, following the experience of the Mosquito, the omission of defensive armament. The company's design bureau developed a number of sketches for the new aircraft, and by May of 1945, a final variant had emerged that promised the best results. By that time, Rolls-Royce had developed its first axial-flow turbojet engine with an estimated thrust of approximately 6,600 pounds. Petter decided to install 2 such engines, placing the engine nacelles in the wing. A distinctive feature of the project was a wing of low aspect ratio, moderate relative thickness of the profile, and a comparatively low specific loading of about 41 pounds per square foot. The wing was not swept. This solution provided the achievement of a maximum cruising altitude, improved maneuverability and controllability, especially at low speeds. A proposal to install a swept wing was considered, but the expected increase in speed of 31 miles per hour did not compensate for an increase in takeoff weight of more than 2 tons. After all details were agreed between English Electric and Rolls-Royce, the project was presented to the leadership of the Ministry of Aircraft and the Royal Air Force. The design and the calculated characteristics fully satisfied the customers, and in the autumn of 1945, English Electric received an official order to produce 4 prototypes of the bomber. On the 7th of January 1946, preparation began for the production of these aircraft. At the same time, the company conducted tests of high-precision equipment using a converted Meteor fighter. Intensive work on new jet engines, which were called Evon, was carried out by Rolls-Royce between 1946 and 1947. However, as a precaution, Petter decided to convert the second prototype to the already production-proven Rolls-Royce Nin jet engines, which, however, had lower power. In addition to the prototypes, a full-scale mock-up was prepared to work out the onboard systems. Assembly of the prototypes proceeded very slowly, taking more than 2 years, which was explained by the novelty of the problems being solved. In particular, already during the assembly of the prototypes, it was decided to replace the Evon engines with new, more powerful jet engines with a thrust of 5,993 pounds each. The long construction time of the prototypes, however, also had a positive side. The Ministry of Aviation, having been convinced of the thoroughness of the design work, in March 1949, before the start of flight tests, placed an order for 132 production aircraft in 3 variants, a bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, and a trainer. Finally, on the 13th of May, 1949, test pilot P. Beaumont flew the first prototype from the airfield at Wharton, to which the company design bureau had been moved. The flight tests were extremely successful. Already on the second flight, Beaumont performed a number of complex maneuvers, confirming the excellent handling of the aircraft. That same prototype demonstrated its outstanding flight characteristics at the Farnborough Air Show in the summer of 1949. The tests of the remaining 3 prototypes that year were equally successful, the last of which was used to develop aerial refueling. In the Air Force, the new bomber received the code name Canberra. However, for serial production, the aircraft design had to be modified somewhat. During the development of the Canberra, it was envisaged that its crew would consist of 2 people, a pilot and a navigator, equipped with a precision bombing sighting installation. But by the time of the Canberra's trials, that equipment had not yet been completed. Therefore, the military demanded that a place for a 3rd crew member, a bomber, be provided on production aircraft and that an optical bombing sight be installed. Petter had to urgently modify the nose, which received additional glazing. At the same time, the installation of new, more powerful jet engines with a thrust of 6,504 pounds each was developed, and additional teardrop fuel tanks were fitted on the wingtips. In this form, the aircraft was accepted into service and put into production. The first production Canberra flew on the 21st of April 1950 under the control of P. Beaumont. At the height of the Korean War, the British government decided to accelerate the rearmament of its bomber force, for which, in addition to the English Electric factory in Preston, the companies Avro, Handley Page, and Short Brothers were involved in Canberra production. Simultaneously with the production of the main version, but in much smaller numbers, production of the modifications provided for by the 1947 specification was set up: a high-precision photographic reconnaissance aircraft and a trainer. The latter had a modified forward fuselage where instructor and pupil sat side by side and dual controls were fitted. Overall, the Air Force leadership and the Ministry of Aviation, taking into account expected export orders, planned to build about 1,000 Canberras, which would become the standard tactical bomber of the RAF. In December 1950, the first production Canberras began to arrive at the 231st Training Squadron, where crew training took place. It was short. For the preparation of line pilots, 20 hours of flight time on training and combat meteors, and 3 hours on the trainer Canberra were considered sufficient. This testified to the ease of handling and reliability of the new bombers. Therefore, already in January 1951, the re-equipping of Bomber Command combat squadrons with Canberras began, the first being the 101st and the 617th. Releasing production machines, the company English Electric continued its experimental developments. In July 1952, a prototype of a target-marking bomber based on the previous model entered testing. This machine opened the 2nd generation of the Canberra because it was fitted with more powerful even engines with a thrust of 7,500 pounds and with built-in fuel tanks in the wing. The characteristics of the new 5th were significantly improved. The externally distinctive feature was an optically flat panel in the lower glazed fairing of the nose section of the fuselage. The aircraft did not enter serial production. The company also considered fitting the Canberra with Bristol Olympus engines and with Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire engines, and experimental examples of the machine were produced for that purpose. But preference was given to the Evon engines. Using the work carried out on the 5th model, the designers developed a new and rather promising 6th model. The prototype flew in June 1954. The machine had a fuselage lengthened by 1 foot. Some of them were converted into a bomber attacker by installing an under-fuselage container with 4 20mm guns. On the basis of the 6, a high-altitude photographic reconnaissance aircraft was developed. As on the 3s, the 7s were fitted with cameras for high-altitude photography and the bombing equipment was removed. In 1953 to 1954, Petter and the engineers of his design bureau, analyzing the results of the air war in Korea, concluded that the range of tasks for the Canberra as a tactical bomber needed to be expanded. In addition to classic horizontal flight bomb delivery, the aircraft was required to attack enemy communications, for which the installation of powerful cannon armament had to be provided. By minimal field modifications, the bomber had to be convertible into a photographic reconnaissance aircraft. The requirement was also put forward to carry tactical atomic weapons. To accomplish all these tasks, Petter developed a peculiar concept of a high-altitude bomber attacker, a universal aircraft, on the basis of which the prototype of the 8th model was designed. Keeping the airframe and power plant of the 6th, the new aircraft received a completely redesigned nose section. The crew was reduced to 2 persons. For better pilot visibility, a large teardrop canopy was installed, offset to the left of the longitudinal axis of symmetry. The navigator had 2 seats, a starting seat in the cockpit behind the pilot and a working seat in the fully sealed nose section of the fuselage, where an optical bombing sight was installed. For firing at ground targets, the company Boulton Paul created a special compact quick-release container with 4 20mm British Hispano guns. 30mm guns could also be installed. The container was placed in the rear bomb bay. Under the wings, 2 pylons appeared for suspension of 1,000-pound bombs, or of rocket dispensers with unguided rockets. For photographic reconnaissance, aero cameras could be installed in the rear bomb bay, and in the forward bay there could be carried 16 illumination rockets. In the atomic version, the aircraft could carry a 1-kiloton bomb, for the precise release of which an electronic radio system was intended. On July 23, 1954, the first prototype of the 8th model took off from the Preston airfield. After a short series of successful tests, the British Royal Air Force sanctioned production of the 8s, immediately at 2 factories, English Electric in Preston and Short Brothers in Belfast. In total, 73 Canberras of this modification were produced for the British Royal Air Force. The first production 8s began to arrive in units stationed in West Germany in January 1956. At the same time, photographic reconnaissance versions with the fuselage lengthened to 68 feet were produced. They received new Evon engines with a thrust of 10,035 pounds and the wingspan increased by 4 feet. In Belfast, 22 9s were produced. The 8th model turned out to be the last truly successful bomber version of the Canberra. But by the mid-1950s, everything had changed. Supersonic fighters with radars and air-to-air missiles had appeared. This completely nullified the Canberra's combat potential. From then on, these bombers could only be used in major theaters of war under one condition: if the Allies already had full air superiority and provided them with fighter cover. It made much more sense to use the Canberra in local conflicts, where the risk of encountering a modern enemy was much lower. That is precisely why the 8th model was produced in small batches, and the idea of developing new bomber versions was abandoned entirely. However, the aircraft could still serve as a training or auxiliary platform. The engineers of English Electric, together with the leadership of the Royal Air Force, took advantage of this. Based on the obsolete second models, they created training aircraft. Experimentally, some of these planes were also converted into unmanned aerial targets. The 2 most successful modifications were produced in small batches during the 1960s. The first was designed for training radar operators of all-weather interceptor fighters. The nose section of this aircraft was fitted with antennas of various radar types. The second modification was used for training operators of electronic intelligence and electronic warfare systems, equipped with the appropriate onboard devices. In addition, several aircraft were built to tow aerial targets. Finally, in the early 1960s, part of the production batch of the 6th models was modernized. They received new equipment and underwing pylons for 1,000-pound bombs or pods with unguided rockets. The Canberra quickly attracted interest abroad, and the first contracts for the export of these aircraft soon appeared. Australia became the first foreign customer. The Royal Australian Air Force, as early as the beginning of 1949, even before the first prototype tests, initiated negotiations for licensed production. In 1951, the Australians purchased 2 production bombers for crew training. That same year, the state-owned factory began production of 48 Canberras. They differed from the standard second models by having integral wing fuel tanks. Later, 7 of them were converted into training aircraft. The United States also showed interest in the Canberra. The U.S. Air Force at that time needed a large number of tactical bombers. In 1950, a group of senior American aviation officials inspected the Canberra prototypes. And on February 21, 1951, a production Canberra made a non-stop transatlantic flight from Northern Ireland to Newfoundland, and then continued to Andrews Air Force Base in the United States. After extensive testing, the Americans decided to begin licensed production through the Martin Company. The company significantly redesigned the aircraft, resulting in the B-57 bomber. Since its design differed greatly from the original Canberra, discussing that aircraft falls outside the scope of this narrative. In 1952, 4 Canberra bombers carried out a demonstration flight across 14 Latin American countries. This generated great interest, and soon orders began to pour in from the region. In 1953, Venezuela ordered 6 Canberras. Later, in 1957, another 8 were added to the fleet. Then came orders from other countries. Ecuador purchased 6 aircraft in 1954, while Peru acquired as many as 30. In 1955, the Peruvian Air Force ordered an additional 8 planes. Chile bought 3 reconnaissance aircraft. Argentina, 10 bombers and 2 trainers. A special dual-control modification was also built for the air forces of New Zealand and South Africa. The largest foreign customer became India. In 1957, its Air Force purchased 71 bombers and 10 photographic reconnaissance aircraft. These airplanes were built in a tropical version specially adapted for conditions in India by the company Boulton Paul. In 1965, another 15 machines were acquired. In the 1960s, the Canberras were also purchased by Southern Rhodesia, 18 former British aircraft, Qatar, 2 machines, and Ethiopia, 4. Deliveries of Canberras to European countries proved much more modest. In 1954, France bought 6 aircraft, which it used to test new engines and guided weapon prototypes. The Swedes purchased 2 trainer aircraft. Finally, in 1960, the Royal Air Force transferred 4 Canberras to the West German Luftwaffe. They were reconfigured and used to conduct cartographic work. Altogether, by 1962, 949 Canberras of various modifications had been produced. Of these, 901 aircraft were manufactured in England at the factories of English Electric, Short Brothers, Avro, Handley Page, and Boulton Paul, and 48 were produced in Australia. The Canberra received its combat baptism during the Suez Crisis of 1956. While preparing the operation to occupy the Suez Canal zone, the British concentrated on Malta and Cyprus 17 bomber squadrons and 1 reconnaissance squadron, equipped mainly with Canberras. On the 31st of October, 1956, Canberras from the 12th Squadron made the first combat sorties, attacking Egyptian air bases. And on the 6th of November, 1956, the first and last Canberra in that conflict was lost. A photographic reconnaissance aircraft was intercepted and shot down by Syrian MiGs. In December of 1961, India, at the request of the United Nations, sent 8 aircraft to the Katanga province of the Congo, where UN forces were fighting Katangan separatists. Indian Canberras attacked mainly the separatists' airfields and communications. The combat experience from the Congo operation proved very useful to the crews of these machines in 1965 during the Indo-Pakistani conflict. The Canberras turned out to be the only serviceable bombers in the Indian Air Force. They actively took part in battles, striking enemy airfields and rear facilities. Indian Canberras also participated in the conflicts with Pakistan in 1971 and 1975. During the Falklands Clash in 1982, 8 Argentine Canberras were used to carry out bombing strikes against British ground and naval targets. By day, they operated under the cover of Dagger fighters, the Israeli variant of the Mirage III, and by night they flew independently at medium altitudes. None of them was shot down, although hits by anti-aircraft and air-to-air missiles were recorded. And even now, the Canberras remain in operational service. They are in the inventories of the air forces of several Latin American countries, India and South Africa. In the Royal Air Force of Great Britain, the Canberras were withdrawn from combat units at the end of the 1960s. Today, only a single flying unit is equipped with them, the 360th Squadron, which operates special trainer aircraft with modern electronic warfare systems. These are used to train specialists in electronic warfare and electronic reconnaissance for the air and naval forces. The service life of the Canberra was initially extended until 1995, but it is now clear that these aircraft will meet the 21st century in flight. Experts believe that the Big Old Lady, as the Canberra is respectfully called in England, could well celebrate her 50th anniversary of combat service in 2001. The Canberra was an all-metal airplane of conventional layout, with a single vertical tail and tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel. The fuselage had a circular cross-section and consisted of 3 main compartments. The nose section with the crew cockpit was pressurized and separated by a special bulkhead. All glazed elements of the nose and the pilot's cockpit were manufactured from durable acrylic glass of the Perspex type. For emergency escape, Martin Baker ejection seats were installed in the pilot's cockpit. The navigator could exit through a special hatch in the nose section of the aircraft. Behind the sealed cockpit were the radio-electronic equipment, as well as the pneumatic and hydraulic systems. In the central section of the fuselage were 2 bomb bays with doors operated by hydraulics. The wing was a single, solid structure with 1 main spar that passed straight through the fuselage. The airfoil profile was symmetrical. Up to the engine nacelles, the wing was straight, and beyond them, the leading edge had a sweep of 4 degrees, while the trailing edge had 14 degrees. The ailerons were equipped with internal Irving Westland type mass balance and trim tabs. Along the trailing edge were 4-section flaps, operated hydraulically. Air brakes were installed on both the upper and lower surfaces of the wing. The stabilizer was all metal. The fin had a mixed structure. Its forward section consisted of a wooden panel covered with fabric. The landing gear was a tricycle type with hydraulic retraction. The nose strut retracted backward into the fuselage, while the main struts folded into the wings toward the aircraft's centerline. The wheels were fitted with brakes and low-pressure pneumatic tires manufactured by Dunlop.